Imagine a man so dangerous that the FBI offers $5 million for information leading to his arrest, yet he walks freely through Moscow streets without bodyguards, drinks coffee in public cafes, and conducts business meetings in broad daylight. This is not fiction. This is Semion Mogilevich, and he represents something far more terrifying than any Hollywood gangster. He is a criminal who has become genuinely untouchable, protected by the very structures meant to stop him. Born in a modest Kiev apartment in 1946, this economics graduate would eventually be called the boss of bosses by international law enforcement, accused of everything from billion-dollar financial frauds to attempting to sell enriched uranium to terrorists. His story is not one of romantic outlaws or honor among thieves. It is a case study in how intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking can build a criminal empire that spans continents and corrupts institutions at the highest levels. The man who would become known as Don Semion began life in circumstances that offered no hint of his future. Semion Mogilevich was born on June 30, 1946, in the Podol district of Kyiv, then part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. His mother, Genya, worked as an orthopedic doctor, a respected profession in Soviet society. His father, Yudka, headed a printing enterprise, giving the family a comfortable middle-class existence by Soviet standards. Teachers at his school remembered young Semion as exceptionally bright, displaying intellectual abilities that set him apart from his peers. He excelled in his studies, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and logic. Upon graduating, Mogilevich initially considered following in his father's footsteps into the printing industry, but ultimately chose a different path, enrolling in the economics faculty at Lviv State University. Here is where the story takes its first dark turn. Rather than use his economics degree for legitimate business or government work, Mogilevich saw an opportunity that most would never consider. He understood something fundamental about the Soviet system that his professors never explicitly taught. The massive inefficiencies and restrictions of the planned economy created black markets. And those black markets generated enormous profits for those willing to take the risk. Unlike the stereotypical brutal enforcer or street thug, Mogilevich approached crime as an intellectual exercise, applying economic theory to a legal enterprise. This would become his signature, not the violence-first mentality of common criminals, but calculated, systematic exploitation of systemic weaknesses. His criminal career began with currency speculation in the early 1970s. In the Soviet Union, possession of foreign currency was strictly controlled and often illegal for ordinary citizens. Mogilevich positioned himself near the Kashtan store in Kiev, buying and selling foreign currency and special Soviet checks that could be used to purchase goods unavailable through normal channels. This was relatively small-scale crime, but it taught him valuable lessons about risk management, customer networks, and the corrupt officials who could be bribed to look the other way. In 1974, these activities caught up with him, and he received his first conviction for currency crimes. The punishment was relatively light by Soviet standards, but it marked him permanently in the system. Upon his release, Mogilevich continued his activities, but with greater sophistication. In 1977, he faced his second conviction, this time for fraud. The circumstances of this case reveal something important about his psychology and methodology. According to court records, Mogilevich had helped a friend acquire approximately $2,500 in foreign currency, a serious crime in the USSR. However, during his defense, he deliberately framed the situation differently, claiming he had actually attempted to defraud the person rather than help them. His reasoning was coldly pragmatic. The penalty for fraud was 4 years, while the penalty for illegal currency operations could be 8 years. He chose to accept a conviction for a lesser crime by confessing to something he may not have actually done. This calculated approach to legal consequences would characterize his entire career, always thinking several moves ahead, always choosing the option that minimized his personal risk. After serving his sentence and being released in the early 1980s, Mogilevich identified another opportunity created by Soviet policy. The government was allowing increased Jewish emigration to Israel, and thousands of Soviet Jews were preparing to leave. However, they faced severe restrictions on what they could take with them. Valuable items like jewelry, antiques, art, and precious metals could not be legally exported. Mogilevich approached these emigrants with a simple proposal. He would sell their prohibited valuables within the Soviet Union and transfer the money to them after they reached Israel. It sounded reasonable, even helpful. The emigrants, desperate to salvage something from their lifetime of accumulated possessions, agreed. They never saw the money. Mogilevich simply kept the proceeds, knowing his victims were now thousands of miles away in a foreign country with no practical ability to pursue legal action against him. This scam generated substantial capital and revealed his complete lack of moral constraints. He was defrauding people who were already being forced to leave their homes, stealing from those who had already lost nearly everything. The scheme also demonstrated his ability to identify systemic vulnerabilities, in this case, the intersection of Soviet emigration policy and the impossibility of international legal recourse. By the late 1980s, Mogilevich had accumulated enough capital and connections to begin operating at a different level. He became associated with the Lubertsi Organized Crime Group, one of the most powerful criminal organizations emerging in the chaos of late Soviet and early post-Soviet society. Some sources suggest he later became involved with the even more powerful Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of the largest and most sophisticated Russian organized crime syndicates. Whether he was a full member, an associate, or merely someone who worked alongside these organizations remains unclear, but the connections proved valuable. These were not street gangs, but sophisticated criminal enterprises with international reach, and Mogilevich's financial acumen made him a valuable asset. In 1990, Mogilevich made a crucial decision. He emigrated to Israel. This was not an escape, but a strategic relocation. Israel's law of return granted him citizenship based on his Jewish heritage, giving him an Israeli passport and access to international banking systems and business networks that would have been impossible from the Soviet Union. He established several investment companies and began building his international network. However, Israel would prove to be merely a stepping stone. Within a year, he had married Katalin Pap, a Hungarian citizen, and relocated to Hungary. This was not romance, but strategy. Hungary, in the early 1990s, presented extraordinary opportunities for someone like Mogilevich. The country was transitioning from communism to capitalism, and the privatization of state assets created massive opportunities for those with capital and few scruples. Corruption was widespread, regulations were poorly enforced, and the government was overwhelmed by the complexity of economic transformation. For a sophisticated criminal operator, it was paradise. Mogilevich settled near Budapest and began building his Hungarian empire. His first major visible enterprise was the Black and White Club in Budapest. Officially, it was a bar and nightclub. In reality, it was a high-end brothel. This established his presence in the city's underworld and generated steady revenue, but it was merely the foundation for something larger. Mogilevich began exploiting Hungary's liberal privatization laws to purchase industrial facilities. He acquired factories producing magnets through a company called Magnex. He bought facilities producing launcher systems, including components for surface-to-air missiles. He purchased plants manufacturing mortars, artillery shells, and related military equipment. Western intelligence agencies watched with growing alarm as this convicted Soviet criminal assembled a weapons manufacturing empire in the heart of Europe. Reports from the period indicate Mogilevich attempted to sell approximately 100 hulls of T-54 and T-55 Soviet tanks. These were not museum pieces, but functional military equipment. The buyers allegedly included countries under international sanctions, such as Iran. This represented a massive escalation from currency speculation and fraud. Mogilevich was now trafficking in weapons systems, operating at the intersection of organized crime, international arms dealing, and potentially state-level actors. The profits were enormous, and the risks were correspondingly high. To manage his expanding criminal empire, Mogilevich brought in trusted associates. One of his key lieutenants was Igor Tachenko, known by the criminal nickname Cherep, Skull, a criminal authority from Odessa. Tachenko and his subordinates took charge of the sex industry operations in Budapest, but their role expanded significantly. According to multiple sources, Tachenko established pipelines for trafficking Ukrainian women to Eastern Europe for prostitution, a business that generated millions while causing immeasurable human suffering. This was not the romanticized world of gentlemen criminals. It was exploitation, coercion, and the destruction of lives for profit. As his wealth grew, Mogilevich understood that he needed protection beyond what money could buy. He hired experienced security personnel, former military and intelligence operatives who could provide both physical protection and early warning of law enforcement activity. More importantly, he began cultivating relationships with corrupt officials. This would become a pattern throughout his career. Mogilevich did not simply bribe individual police officers or low-level bureaucrats. He built systematic relationships with senior figures in law enforcement, intelligence services, and government. These were not one-time payments, but long-term, corrupt partnerships that provided him with protection, advance warning of investigations, and the ability to operate with relative impunity. But Mogilevich's most sophisticated tool for evading law enforcement was not bribery or violence. It was identity manipulation. By the mid-1990s, he had accumulated at least 7 documented false identities and multiple passports. Intelligence reports suggested the actual number might be closer to 15 different identity documents from various countries. He operated under the names Semion Mogilevich, Semion Mogilevich, Sergei Schneider, Palagnuk, Simon, Suvorov, and Fisherman. Each identity had associated documentation, bank accounts, and business registrations. This was not crude forgery, but sophisticated identity construction, likely requiring the cooperation of corrupt officials in multiple countries' passport and immigration services. His marriages played a crucial role in this strategy. Beyond Katalin Pop, whom he married to gain Hungarian residency, Mogilevich would marry multiple times, each marriage serving strategic purposes. In 1996, he married Galina Telesh, and he took various surnames from his wives to create new legal identities. By 1999, he had married Olga Schneider, adopting her surname as his primary identity in Russia. This became Sergei Schneider, the identity under which he would later be arrested in Moscow. These were not bigamous marriages in the traditional sense. He appeared to formally divorce before remarrying, maintaining the appearance of legality while using each marriage as a tool for acquiring new citizenship, new passports, and new corporate structures registered under different names. The sophistication of this identity system cannot be overstated. Each identity existed in multiple interconnected systems: passports, driver's licenses, business registrations, bank accounts, property records. Unraveling which companies, assets, and accounts belonged to Mogilevich versus which belonged to legitimate individuals with similar names became nearly impossible for law enforcement. When investigators tried to track his financial transactions, the trail would split into multiple directions, each leading to a different identity with different documentation in different jurisdictions. Some of these identities appeared to be shell companies registered to his various wives or associates, creating additional layers of separation between Mogilevich and his assets. This period also saw Mogilevich cultivating his international network beyond Hungary. He established connections in the United Kingdom, where authorities later discovered £2 million belonging to his company Aragon, registered in the offshore Channel Islands, held in the Royal Bank of Scotland. He maintained operations in Israel through various investment companies. He began building connections in North America, setting the stage for what would become one of the largest corporate frauds in modern history. And crucially, he maintained his Russian connections. the relationships with organized crime groups and corrupt officials that would ultimately provide him with sanctuary when Western law enforcement began closing in. By the mid-1990s, Mogilevich had transformed from a Soviet currency speculator into an international criminal operator of unprecedented sophistication. He controlled prostitution networks, weapons manufacturing facilities, international financial operations, and maintained a complex web of false identities across multiple countries. He was not simply a criminal. He was effectively operating a multinational corporation devoted to illegal enterprise, using business structures, international banking, and corrupt relationships with state officials to achieve a level of operational security that traditional organized crime groups could never match. Law enforcement agencies across Europe were beginning to realize what they were dealing with. This was not a traditional mobster who could be arrested through conventional investigation. Mogilevich's operations were compartmentalized, his true identity obscured behind layers of false documentation, his assets distributed across jurisdictions that did not cooperate effectively with each other. When investigators in one country began tracking his activities, the trail would inevitably lead across borders into another jurisdiction, where the investigation would stall due to lack of cooperation, different legal standards, or simply because Mogilevich had already moved on to another identity in another country. The FBI began building a file on Mogilevich in this period, though he had not yet committed crimes on American soil. Intelligence sharing between European agencies and American law enforcement painted a picture of someone far more dangerous than a typical organized crime figure. He possessed the financial sophistication of a white-collar criminal, the international networks of a major trafficker, the violence capacity of organized crime, and the operational security of an intelligence operative. CIA analysts noted his growing power with concern, recognizing that he represented a new breed of criminal that existing law enforcement structures were poorly equipped to handle. What made Mogilevich particularly dangerous was not just the scope of his operations, but his apparent protection. Rumors circulated in intelligence communities about his connections to Russian security services. Some analysts believed he was providing financial services to Russian intelligence, laundering money, or facilitating covert operations in exchange for protection. Others suggested his relationships with senior Russian officials were purely corrupt. He paid enormous bribes in exchange for being left alone. The truth likely involved elements of both. Whatever the exact nature of these relationships, it was becoming clear that Mogilevich enjoyed a level of protection that made him effectively untouchable, as long as he remained in countries where Russian influence was strong. Yet despite this growing power, Mogilevich faced threats from within the criminal world itself. In May 1995, Czech police prepared a special operation at U Holubu, at the Pigeons, a restaurant in Prague that Mogilevich owned. They had intelligence that he would be meeting with Sergei Mikhailov, the head of the powerful Solntseevskaya criminal organization. The plan was to arrest both men during this meeting. However, Mogilevich never appeared at the restaurant. Later intelligence suggested that the Solntseevskaya group had not planned a business meeting at all. They intended to kill Mogilevich. According to Czech authorities, he owed the Solntseevskaya organization $5 million, and they had decided to resolve the debt permanently. How Mogilevich learned of the trap remains unclear. He may have had sources within Czech law enforcement who warned him about the police operation. He may have had informants within the Solntseevskaya organization who alerted him to the assassination plan. Or he may have simply been suspicious and decided not to attend. Whatever the reason, his survival demonstrated both his operational security and his vulnerability. Despite all his wealth, false identities, and corrupt relationships, he was still at risk from other criminals. The incident sent a message to law enforcement. Mogilevich was not invincible, and the criminal organizations he worked with did not necessarily regard him as an untouchable partner. He was a businessman to them, and in that world, unpaid debts could be fatal. The aftermath of the Prague incident showed how his protective networks operated. Despite the failed arrest and the assassination plot, Czech authorities were unable to apprehend Mogilevich in subsequent operations. Shortly after, he was banned from entering the Czech Republic for 10 years, declared persona non grata in Hungary despite years of operating there openly, and banned from the United Kingdom. These travel restrictions were significant but hardly crippling. He simply shifted his base of operations, spending more time in Israel and beginning to focus more heavily on Russia, where the government was showing little interest in cooperating with Western law enforcement against him. By the late 1990s, Semion Mogilevich had built something unprecedented, a truly international criminal enterprise that combined the violence and extortion of traditional organized crime with the sophistication of multinational corporate fraud. He had moved beyond the limitations of ethnic-based crime groups, working with Russian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Italian, and other criminal organizations as business partners rather than as a member of any single group. He possessed multiple identities and citizenship in at least 4 countries: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and Hungary. He controlled assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, distributed across countless shell companies and offshore accounts. And he had built relationships with corrupt officials in multiple countries that provided him with advance warning of investigations and protection from arrest. Yet, this was only the foundation. The empire he had built in Eastern Europe was impressive by the standards of organized crime. But Mogilevich was planning something far more ambitious. He was looking toward North America, toward the massive capital pools available in Western financial markets, toward opportunities for fraud on a scale that would dwarf everything he had done before. He understood that the real money was not in prostitution or arms dealing, profitable as those were. The real money was in financial crime, in manipulating stock markets, in creating elaborate corporate structures that could move hundreds of millions of dollars while appearing completely legitimate. And he had found the perfect vehicle for this, a small Canadian company that would become known as YBM Magnex International, the vehicle for one of the largest securities frauds in North American history. In 1995, Mogilevich became a co-owner of YBM Magnex International, a company registered in Canada but operating primarily in the United States. On paper, YBM Magnex was a manufacturer of industrial magnets with operations in Hungary and Pennsylvania, a legitimate international manufacturing business. The company's prospectus described extensive manufacturing facilities, growing revenues, and promising expansion plans. Within 2 years, YBM Magnex shares were trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and the stock price was climbing steadily. By 1997, the company conducted a secondary offering, selling 3.2 million shares at 16.5 Canadian dollars each, raising tens of millions in new capital. Institutional investors, pension funds, and thousands of individual investors bought in, believing they had found an undervalued manufacturing company with excellent growth prospects. They had actually bought into an elaborate fraud. YBM Magnex was not a legitimate business. It was a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as a manufacturing company. The actual manufacturing operations were minimal, barely functional facilities that existed primarily to maintain the illusion of legitimate business activity. The company's reported revenues were largely fictitious, created through circular transactions between shell companies controlled by Mogilevich and his associates. Money from criminal enterprises, prostitution, weapons dealing, extortion, financial fraud in Europe was flowing into YBM Magnex through layers of corporate structures designed to make it appear as legitimate business revenue. The rising stock price was not driven by actual business performance, but by market manipulation and the willingness of legitimate investors to believe in a profitable industrial company. The operation required sophisticated financial engineering. Mogilevich and his partners created what prosecutors would later call the Mogilevich Enterprise, a network of interconnected corporations spanning multiple countries. These companies engaged in transactions with each other, creating the appearance of genuine business activity. One shell company would purchase magnets from IBM Magnex, generating revenue for the Canadian company. The purchasing company would be owned by another shell company, which in turn was owned by a trust registered in an offshore jurisdiction. The money flowing through this system appeared legitimate to auditors and regulators, each transaction documented with proper invoicing and contracts. But the ultimate source of much of this capital was criminal proceeds, being laundered through the corporate structure and converted into publicly traded stock that could be sold on legitimate exchanges. Igor Fisherman, identified by FBI investigators as Mogilevich's partner, served as the visible face of IBM Magnex, holding executive positions and dealing with investors and analysts. This arrangement allowed Mogilevich to maintain distance from the day-to-day operations while controlling the company from behind the scenes. Fisherman presented IBM Magnex as a success story at investment conferences, met with financial analysts, and maintained the narrative of a growing manufacturing business. Meanwhile, the actual business of IBM Magnex was converting dirty money into clean assets and artificially inflating stock prices to defraud investors. The scheme worked remarkably well for several years. IBM Magnex's stock price continued rising, creating paper profits for early investors and generating enthusiasm among financial analysts. The company's market capitalization reached approximately $350 million at its peak. Institutional investors held significant positions. Financial newspapers ran positive articles about this emerging success story. Mogilevich and his associates were accomplishing something extraordinary. They were using one of the world's most regulated and transparent financial systems, the North American stock markets, to launder criminal proceeds on a massive scale, while simultaneously defrauding thousands of legitimate investors. But law enforcement was watching. The FBI had been building a case against Mogilevich for years, tracking his activities across Europe and trying to understand the scope of his operations. When evidence emerged connecting him to IBM Magnex, agents realized they finally had jurisdiction. Crimes committed on American soil using American financial systems. They began coordinating with Canadian authorities and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The investigation was complex, requiring agents to untangle the web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and circular transactions that created the illusion of legitimate business. Financial forensic specialists worked to trace the actual flow of money through the corporate structure, identifying which transactions represented genuine business activity versus which were simply moving criminal proceeds through the system. On May 13, 1998, the FBI raided IBM Magnex headquarters in Pennsylvania. Simultaneously, Canadian authorities moved against the company's Toronto offices. The raids were carefully coordinated, designed to seize documents and electronic records before they could be destroyed. News of the raids caused IBM Magnex stock to collapse immediately, wiping out hundreds of millions in investor wealth within hours. Pension funds lost millions. Individual investors who had put their retirement savings into what they believed was a promising manufacturer watched their investments become worthless. The human cost was enormous. People who had nothing to do with organized crime, who had simply made what they thought was a prudent investment decision, lost everything. The investigation revealed the scope of the fraud. Between 1993 and 1998, prosecutors alleged, the Mogilevich enterprise had defrauded investors of more than $150 million. The actual figure might have been higher, as tracing all the money through the complex corporate structure proved impossible. In April 2003, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania issued a 45-count indictment against Mogilevich and his associates. The charges included racketeering, securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, Mogilevich faced up to 400 years in prison. The FBI added him to their most wanted list, initially offering a reward of $100,000 for information leading to his arrest. But Mogilevich was far beyond the reach of American law enforcement. He had never personally entered the United States during the entire IBM Magnex operation, carefully orchestrating everything from Europe and Israel. By the time the indictment was issued, he was living primarily in Russia, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Russian authorities showed no interest in arresting him on American charges. The FBI could document his crimes, prove his guilt to any reasonable standard, offer substantial rewards for his capture, and it made absolutely no difference. He was effectively immune from prosecution as long as he remained in Russia. While American investigators were building their case against IBM Magnex, another massive scandal was emerging that would further cement Mogilevich's reputation as a world-class criminal mastermind. In 1999, USA Today published an investigation into what became known as the Bank of New York money laundering scandal, one of the largest financial crimes in American banking history. The newspaper reported that billions of dollars had been moved through Bank of New York accounts as part of an elaborate Russian money laundering operation. At the center of this scheme was a company called Magnex International. According to the investigation, Magnex controlled 4 accounts at Bank of New York and 1 at Republic National Bank. Over a period of several years, approximately $7 billion had moved through these accounts, originating from Russia and various offshore jurisdictions. The transactions were structured to avoid triggering banking regulations designed to detect money laundering. Funds would arrive in amounts just below reporting thresholds, or would be split among multiple accounts to obscure the total volume of money being moved. Once in the American banking system, the money was transferred to other accounts, wired to offshore locations, or used to purchase assets, effectively cleaning it and making it appear as legitimate funds. USA Today's investigation, citing intelligence sources, identified Semion Mogilevich as the founder of Magnex International. This revelation was explosive. If accurate, it meant Mogilevich had penetrated one of America's largest and most reputable banks, using it as a vehicle for laundering criminal proceeds on an unprecedented scale. The $7 billion represented not just his own operations, but potentially money laundering services provided to other Russian criminal organizations, corrupt officials, and oligarchs who needed to move money out of Russia and into Western financial systems. Mogilevich was not just running his own criminal enterprises, he was operating as a banker to the entire Russian criminal underworld. The mechanics of the Bank of New York scheme demonstrated extraordinary sophistication. Magnex was not obviously connected to Mogilevich or to criminal activity. It appeared to be a legitimate international trading company with proper corporate registration. The individuals managing the accounts at Bank of New York appeared to be business people, not criminals. The transactions themselves were documented with invoices, contracts, and other paperwork that made them appear as normal international trade finance. Only by examining the entire network of transactions over years could investigators see the pattern. Money flowing in from questionable sources, moving through multiple accounts, and emerging in forms that obscured its origins. Several Bank of New York executives eventually faced charges related to the scandal, accused of failing to properly scrutinize suspicious transactions or actively participating in the money laundering. The bank paid substantial fines and implemented new compliance procedures. But Mogilevich himself, once again, remained beyond reach. He had not personally appeared at any Bank of New York branch. He had not signed any documents using his real name. The connections between him and Magnex were established through intelligence analysis and investigation, rather than direct documentary evidence. Proving in court that he was the beneficial owner and controller of Magnex would be challenging. And it hardly mattered, since he was living in Russia and refusing to submit to American jurisdiction. The Bank of New York scandal revealed something crucial about Mogilevich's operations. He was not just a criminal, but a facilitator, providing services to other criminals, corrupt officials, and anyone else willing to pay for access to his money laundering networks. This created a perverse form of protection. If Russian officials, oligarchs, or security service personnel were using Mogilevich's services to move their own money, they had a direct interest in ensuring he remained free and operational. His criminal enterprise was not just protecting itself. It was providing services that made him valuable to powerful people who could ensure his continued freedom. While these financial operations were making headlines in the West, Mogilevich was expanding into an even more sensitive area, the energy sector, specifically the enormously lucrative and politically charged business of natural gas supplies between Russia, Central Asia, and Europe. This would bring him into direct contact with national governments, international energy companies, and the highest levels of political power in multiple countries. It would also lead to allegations connecting him to one of the most controversial companies in post-Soviet history, RosUkrEnergo. RosUkrEnergo, registered in Switzerland, emerged in 2004 as the middleman for natural gas supplies from Turkmenistan to Ukraine. The company's ownership structure was opaque, registered through offshore entities that obscured the true beneficial owners. On one side stood Gazprom, the Russian state-controlled energy giant. On the other side stood Ukrainian business interests represented by oligarch Dmytro Firtash. RosUkrEnergo would purchase gas from Turkmenistan, mix it with Russian gas, and sell it to Ukraine's state energy company Naftogaz. The volumes were enormous, billions of cubic meters annually, and the profit margins were substantial. Control over this gas flow meant control over Ukraine's energy security and generated profits measured in hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Almost immediately, questions arose about who really controlled RosUkrEnergo. Yulia Tymoshenko, who would become Prime Minister of Ukraine, publicly alleged that Semion Mogilevich was behind the company. Ukrainian security services launched investigations into whether RosUkrEnergo was under the indirect control of Mogilevich. The allegations were explosive. If true, it meant a wanted international criminal was effectively controlling a critical piece of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The geopolitical implications were enormous. Was Russia using a criminal intermediary to maintain leverage over Ukraine? Were corrupt Ukrainian officials cooperating with organized crime to steal from their own country? The questions multiplied, but clear answers were difficult to obtain. The evidence connecting Mogilevich to RosUkrEnergo was circumstantial but compelling. Investigative journalists traced connections between RosUkrEnergo's management and Mogilevich's previous business operations. Oleg Palchikov, who became an executive director of RosUkrEnergo, had previously been a representative of Ural Transgas, a company that preceded RosUkrEnergo in the gas intermediary role and was widely suspected of being controlled by Mogilevich. Corporate structures connected to Mogilevich's former wives appeared in the ownership chains of companies doing business with RosUkrEnergo. His associate Igor Fisherman's name appeared in connection with related entities. The pattern suggested Mogilevich's involvement, but proving it definitively was another matter. RosUkrEnergo had a predecessor company, Ural Transgas, that had operated in the early 2000s, handling similar gas trading between Russia, Turkmenistan, and Ukraine. Western intelligence agencies believed Mogilevich controlled Ural Transgas, using it both as a profitable business and as a money laundering vehicle. The company's operations were structured around barter transactions, Turkmen gas in exchange for goods and commodities, which created opportunities for price manipulation and hidden profits. When Ural Transgas became too controversial, with too many questions about its ownership and operations, it was effectively replaced by RosUkrEnergo in 2004. Many of the same individuals remained involved, the business model was similar, and suspicions about Mogilevich's involvement persisted. The Ukrainian investigation into Mogilevich's connection to RosUkrEnergo became its own scandal. According to reports, the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, had assembled a substantial case file, approximately 20 volumes of documentation and evidence. Then, in what appeared to be a politically motivated move, the investigation was suddenly terminated, and the files were reportedly destroyed. The deputy head of the SBU who ordered the destruction, Andrei Kozhemyakin, later received a high position on Yulia Tymoshenko's political party list. The implication was clear. Investigating Mogilevich's connections to Ukrainian energy trading had become too politically sensitive, threatening too many powerful interests, and the evidence was destroyed rather than allow the investigation to continue. Whether Mogilevich actually controlled RosUkrEnergo remains disputed. Dmytro Firtash, who openly acknowledged owning 45% of the company, denied any connection to Mogilevich. Russian officials denied the allegations. But the pattern of circumstantial evidence, the corporate connections, the presence of individuals previously associated with Mogilevich's operations, and the destruction of the Ukrainian investigation files all suggested something was being hidden. At minimum, it appeared Mogilevich had some role in the network of companies and individuals involved in the gas trading business, even if the exact nature and extent of his control could not be definitively proven. The significance of this alleged involvement cannot be overstated. Natural gas supplies to Ukraine were not just a commercial matter, but a geopolitical weapon. Russia repeatedly cut off or threatened to cut off gas supplies to Ukraine during political disputes, using energy as leverage to influence Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy. If a wanted international criminal was involved in this system, even indirectly, it added another layer of corruption and criminality to an already complex situation. It also suggested Mogilevich had relationships with Russian state entities like Gazprom and with Ukrainian political figures, operating at a level far above ordinary organized crime. During this period, even more disturbing allegations about Mogilevich's activities began surfacing in intelligence reports and media investigations. These accusations moved beyond financial crime and into areas of immediate threat to international security. Reports emerged claiming Mogilevich had attempted to sell enriched uranium to Osama bin Laden, then the world's most wanted terrorist. Other allegations suggested he had sold weapons to Iran, Iraq, and Serbia, countries under various international sanctions and arms embargoes. About attempting to sell uranium to bin Laden were particularly alarming. If true, this meant Mogilevich was not just a financial criminal or even a major trafficker, but someone willing to provide terrorists with materials that could potentially be used for weapons of mass destruction. The FBI took these allegations seriously enough that agents began referring to him as Don Semion and dramatically increased the reward for information leading to his arrest. The Bureau's public statements emphasized that Mogilevich controlled a massive international criminal network and represented a unique threat to American security. However, concrete evidence for the most extreme allegations proved elusive. Did Mogilevich actually attempt to sell uranium to bin Laden, or was this intelligence speculation based on his weapons-dealing activities and bin Laden's known interest in acquiring weapons of mass destruction? Did he directly sell weapons to sanctioned countries, or did his Hungarian weapons factories sell to intermediaries who then resold to prohibited end users? The distinction mattered legally, but perhaps not practically. Even if Mogilevich did not personally hand uranium to terrorists, his demonstrated willingness to traffic in weapons, his access to former Soviet military equipment and potentially nuclear materials, and his complete lack of moral constraints made him a plausible supplier for the world's most dangerous actors. The weapons allegations were more firmly established. Mogilevich's ownership of Hungarian weapons manufacturing facilities was documented. Intelligence reports tracking attempted sales of tank hulls and missile components were based on specific intelligence intercepts and observations. His network's involvement in arms trafficking was well established, even if every specific transaction could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. What made this particularly dangerous was the combination of his international networks, his sophisticated money laundering capabilities that could hide payment flows, and his protection from prosecution. A terrorist organization or rogue state looking to acquire weapons systems under the table would find in Mogilevich an ideal supplier, someone with access to weapons, the infrastructure to move them covertly, and immunity from prosecution. The allegations of connections to Italian organized crime groups suggested Mogilevich was building something unprecedented, a truly international criminal network that transcended traditional ethnic and geographic boundaries. Historically, organized crime groups had been somewhat balkanized. Italian mafia families controlled certain territories and activities. Russian and Ukrainian groups dominated other areas. Asian triads had their spheres of influence. These groups might cooperate occasionally, but they generally remained distinct organizations. Mogilevich appeared to be operating differently, forming business partnerships across these traditional boundaries, providing services to multiple criminal organizations, and building a network based on financial arrangements rather than ethnic loyalty or traditional criminal hierarchies. This approach made him more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. Traditional organized crime groups offer their members significant protection. They retaliate against anyone who attacks their members. They provide legal support. They maintain omerta, codes of silence. But Mogilevich's business-based approach meant these protections were weaker. He was not a made member of the Russian wor v zakone, thieves in law, tradition, not a formal member of any single organization. He was a service provider who worked with many groups, and if those groups decided he was more valuable dead than alive, the traditional protections might not apply. The Prague restaurant incident in 1995 had already demonstrated this vulnerability. That incident deserves deeper examination because it reveals both the threats Mogilevich faced and the sophistication of his security measures. Czech police had planned to raid the U Holubu restaurant to arrest Mogilevich during his meeting with Sergei Mikhailov, head of the Solntsevskaya organization. The police operation was carefully planned, with multiple units positioned around the restaurant and surveillance in place. But Mogilevich never arrived. Czech authorities later claimed that their intelligence indicated the Solntsevskaya group had not actually planned a business meeting. They intended to kill Mogilevich over an unpaid debt of $5 million. How did Mogilevich learn about either the police operation or the assassination plot? The most likely explanation is that he had sources within law enforcement who warned him about the police raid, and possibly separate sources within or close to the Solntsevskaya organization who learned about the assassination plan. This level of advanced intelligence suggests a sophisticated network of informants and corrupt officials providing him with information. It also demonstrates his vulnerability. Despite all his wealth and power, he was still at risk from other criminals who saw him as a debtor or rival rather than a protected partner. The aftermath showed how his protection networks operated, but also their limitations. He was banned from Czech Republic for 10 years, declared persona non grata in Hungary, and banned from the United Kingdom. Yet, despite these official prohibitions, he was not arrested. In Hungary, where he had operated openly for years, where police certainly knew his location and activities, he was simply told to leave, rather than being apprehended and extradited to countries that wanted him. This pattern repeated across Europe. Countries would declare him unwelcome, but they would not arrest him. The suspicion among investigators was that he had compromised officials in each country's law enforcement and political structures, people who ensured that, while he might be asked to leave, he would not be detained and handed over to American or other authorities. By the early 2000s, Semion Mogilevich had achieved something remarkable and terrifying. He was simultaneously one of the FBI's most wanted criminals and someone who could operate openly in multiple countries. He was accused of billions of dollars in financial fraud, weapons trafficking, and potentially attempting to supply terrorists with nuclear materials. Yet he walked free. He had allegedly penetrated major international banks, controlled energy trading companies, and built criminal networks spanning continents. He possessed multiple identities, citizenships in multiple countries, and a network of corrupt officials and intelligence sources that provided him with advance warning of law enforcement operations. But this empire had a critical vulnerability. It depended on his continued freedom and his ability to operate across borders. The travel bans were beginning to limit his movements. Western law enforcement agencies were coordinating their investigations more effectively, and most critically, his high profile was making him a liability to some of the powerful interests that had previously protected him. Being known as the most dangerous mobster in the world might intimidate ordinary criminals, but it made him a target for law enforcement agencies and potentially expendable to political actors who might find it convenient to sacrifice him. The question was not whether law enforcement would eventually move against him, but when and where, and whether his protection networks would hold, or whether he would finally face justice for decades of criminal activity. On January 24, 2008, Russian police from the Economic Crimes Division of the Moscow Ministry of Internal Affairs arrested a man using the identity Sergei Schneider at a Moscow location. Within hours, news agencies worldwide reported that Semion Mogilevich, one of the FBI's most wanted criminals, had finally been captured. After decades of evading international law enforcement, operating across multiple continents, and building a criminal empire estimated to be worth billions, he was in custody. Western law enforcement agencies celebrated. Finally, it seemed, justice would be served. The celebration was premature. The charges against Mogilevich, operating under his Sergei Schneider identity, related to a Moscow-based perfume retail chain called Arbat Prestige. Prosecutors alleged that Mogilevich had assisted the company's director, Vladimir Nekrasov, in evading more than 115 million rubles in taxes between 2005 and 2006. By Russian criminal standards, this was a relatively minor case, tax evasion worth roughly $3 million at the time. Compared to the hundreds of millions he had allegedly stolen through YBM Magnex, the billions allegedly laundered through Bank of New York, or his suspected involvement in arms trafficking and energy sector corruption, the Arbat Prestige case seemed almost trivial. Why had Russian authorities, who had ignored decades of far more serious allegations, suddenly decided to arrest him over a perfume store tax case? The timing was suspicious. Mogilevich's arrest came during intense international scrutiny of RosUkrEnergo and allegations about his involvement in Ukrainian gas trading. European law enforcement agencies were pressing Russia for cooperation in various investigations. The arrest appeared calculated to demonstrate that Russian authorities were taking action against organized crime, without actually addressing the serious international charges against him. By arresting him on a relatively minor domestic charge, Russia could claim to be prosecuting Mogilevich while maintaining complete control over the process and ensuring he would not be extradited to face the far more serious American charges. Mogilevich's lawyers immediately proclaimed his innocence, claiming the Arbat Prestige allegations were baseless. They requested bail, initially offering 5 million rubles. The court denied the request. They increased the offer to 50 million rubles, over $1.5 million. Again, the court refused. For months, Mogilevich remained in pretrial detention while prosecutors prepared their case. In April 2008, reports emerged that prosecutors were considering additional charges related to forged documents, specifically the court order that had changed his official birth date from June 30th to July 7th. The case appeared to be expanding, suggesting authorities were building a more substantial prosecution. But then, the case began falling apart. Witnesses failed to corroborate the prosecution's theory. Evidence that was supposed to prove Mogilevich's involvement in the tax evasion scheme proved ambiguous or inconclusive. On July 24, 2009, after 18 months in custody, Mogilevich was released on his own recognizance, required only to sign a pledge not to leave Moscow. The trial proceeded slowly, with prosecutors appearing increasingly unable to substantiate their allegations. Finally, on April 18, 2011, the Moscow court made its decision. The charges against both Mogilevich and Nekrasov were dismissed for lack of corpus delicti, essentially, lack of evidence that a crime had been committed. The message was unmistakable. Russian authorities had arrested Mogilevich, held him for a year and a half, subjected him to prosecution, and then released him when the case collapsed. To Western law enforcement, this looked like theater, a performance designed to appear as if Russia was addressing the Mogilevich problem while actually ensuring he faced no serious consequences. The minor domestic charges allowed Russia to claim it was prosecuting him. The long detention without bail punished him enough to be credible, and the eventual dismissal of charges ensured he remained free. It was sophisticated political maneuvering disguised as legal proceedings. Investigative journalists who examined the case noted several anomalies. Evgeny Vishenkov, co-owner of the publication Fontanka.ru, who had covered Mogilevich for years, described the trial proceedings as unusual. The evidence presented seemed weak from the beginning. Prosecutors appeared to struggle to establish basic elements of their case. Some observers suggested the arrest had been politically motivated, possibly related to conflicts between different factions within Russian business and political elites, with Mogilevich being temporarily detained as leverage in disputes that had nothing to do with the actual charges. Once those disputes were resolved, the case was allowed to collapse, and he was freed. Ukrainian journalist Mustafa Nayem, writing for Ukrainska Pravda in 2008, made a striking observation about Mogilevich's life in Moscow. Despite being wanted by international law enforcement, despite the FBI reward, despite years of allegations about his criminal activities, Mogilevich moved around Moscow without significant security precautions. He did not travel in armored convoys surrounded by bodyguards like typical high-level organized crime figures. He did not hide in fortified compounds. According to Nayem, any Ukrainian or Russian politician or businessman who wanted to meet with Mogilevich could do so relatively easily. His elusiveness, so emphasized by law enforcement agencies, was essentially a myth. He was not hiding. He was living openly in a city of 12 million people, and Russian authorities had no interest in detaining him for extradition to countries where he faced serious charges. This reality revealed something crucial about Mogilevich's protection. It was not the protection of a crime boss who hides behind layers of security and stays constantly mobile to avoid capture. It was the protection of someone integrated into power structures at a level where formal arrest was not a serious threat. Multiple sources suggested Mogilevich had relationships with Russian security services, the FSB, military intelligence, and other agencies. The nature of these relationships remained opaque, but several theories circulated among intelligence analysts and investigative journalists. As Mogilevich entered his late 70s, questions arose about succession and the future of his operations. Criminal enterprises built around a single charismatic or particularly capable leader often fragment after that leader's death or incapacitation. Did Mogilevich have trusted lieutenants who could maintain his networks? Had he structured his operations in ways that would survive his death, or would they collapse into factional conflicts? The answers remained unclear, hidden behind the same walls of secrecy that had protected his operations for decades. What was clear was that Mogilevich represented something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. Traditional organized crime groups operated within specific geographic areas and ethnic communities. They controlled territories, ran protection rackets, managed vice industries, and occasionally ventured into more sophisticated crimes. But their operations remained fundamentally local, bound by geography and ethnic ties. Even when they expanded internationally, they generally maintained the same basic structure and methods. Mogilevich had built something different, a truly international criminal enterprise based on financial sophistication, strategic use of corporate structures, exploitation of regulatory gaps between jurisdictions, and systematic corruption of officials. He did not control territory in the traditional sense. He controlled assets, accounts, and relationships. His power came not from armed enforcers on street corners, but from shell companies, offshore accounts, and corrupt officials in multiple countries. This approach was more resilient than traditional organized crime because it was less visible and harder to disrupt through conventional law enforcement. The response from law enforcement had been largely ineffective. International cooperation improved over the decades, but remained hampered by differing legal systems, jurisdictional disputes, and the fact that some countries simply would not cooperate in cases involving certain individuals. Financial regulations tightened after scandals like the Bank of New York case, but sophisticated criminals found new methods to circumvent new rules. Prosecutors could document crimes and secure indictments, but could not obtain custody of defendants living in non-cooperative countries. Some law enforcement officials and analysts concluded that the traditional approach of investigating, indicting, and seeking to arrest criminals like Mogilevich was fundamentally inadequate. These were not street criminals who could be surveilled, arrested, and prosecuted through conventional means. They were operating at the intersection of crime, business, and politics, protected by corrupt officials and potentially by intelligence services. Bringing them to justice would require not just better law enforcement cooperation, but political will to confront the corrupt systems that protected them. And that political will often did not exist because too many powerful people benefited from those same corrupt systems. The Mogilevich case also raised uncomfortable questions about the rule of law in the post-Cold War international system. The fall of the Soviet Union had been supposed to usher in an era of increased international cooperation, stronger institutions, and more effective mechanisms for addressing transnational crime. Instead, the chaos of the transition period had created opportunities for criminals and corrupt officials to loot state assets, establish criminal enterprises with international reach, and build protection networks that spanned multiple countries. 30 years later, many of these criminals remained free, wealthy, and effectively immune from prosecution. As Mogilevich approached 80 years old, his legacy was not the romanticized figure of popular culture's mobsters, but something far more troubling. He had demonstrated that in the modern, interconnected world, a sufficiently intelligent and ruthless criminal could build an empire spanning continents, commit crimes affecting millions of people and billions of dollars, and escape any meaningful consequences. He had shown that corruption at high levels of government could provide protection that made traditional law enforcement irrelevant. And he had proven that jurisdictional boundaries and lack of international cooperation created spaces where criminals could operate with effective immunity. The $5 million reward for information leading to his arrest remains active. The FBI's wanted poster still displays his photograph, now showing an elderly man with thinning gray hair and a heavyset build. The charges remain filed, the evidence remains documented, the victims remain uncompensated. And in Moscow, Semion Mogilevich continues his life, free despite decades of allegations, protected despite mountains of evidence, untouchable despite the efforts of the world's most sophisticated law enforcement agencies. His story is not one of criminal genius triumphant over justice. It is a story of systemic failure, of corruption protecting the guilty, of a world where sufficient wealth and connections can override law and accountability. He is living proof that, for some criminals, in some places, under some circumstances, justice simply does not apply.